One second, your baby is crying with everything they have, and then, without any warning, the crying stops. So completely, it's like someone turned off a switch. Not a gradual wind down, not a trail of sniffles, a sudden, total, almost surgical silence that leaves you standing there holding your breath and waiting for it to start again. And the strangest part is the feeling that follows. Not relief exactly, but a kind of bewildered unease, as if the sudden silence is somehow more alarming than the crying was. That instinct, the feeling that something just happened that you don't quite understand, is worth trusting, because something genuinely interesting did just happen inside your baby's brain. Babies do not cry randomly, and they do not stop randomly. Every shift in their vocal behavior is driven by a nervous system that is operating according to a very precise internal logic. Understanding that logic, really understanding it, changes the entire experience of being with a crying baby, and especially of being with one who suddenly stops. The first thing to understand is that crying, for an infant, is not simply an emotional expression. It is a full-body physiological event that consumes enormous neurological resources. When a baby cries, their heart rate elevates, their cortisol levels rise, their muscles engage, and their entire nervous system shifts into a high activation state that the body can only sustain for so long. And this is where it becomes interesting, because the sudden stop is not simply the crying ending, it is the nervous system hitting a specific internal threshold and switching states. Infant researchers call this a state transition, a rapid, often abrupt shift from one neurological state to another that can happen so quickly it appears almost mechanical from the outside. But the speed of the transition is not a malfunction. It is actually evidence of a healthy, responsive nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do under conditions of stress and relief. But here is what most parents never get told. The reason the crying stops so suddenly is often not because the problem was solved, but because the brain shifted its strategy entirely. When the crying state becomes unsustainable, when the physiological cost of maintaining that level of distress exceeds what the system can hold, the brain doesn't gradually reduce the crying, it simply stops it. This is the nervous system's version of a circuit breaker, a protective mechanism that prevents the infant from sustaining a physiological state that would be genuinely harmful if it continued unchecked on Fenoct. Something subtle is happening here. The silence is not the absence of something, it is the presence of something entirely new, a different neurological state with its own qualities and its own needs. And the needs of that new state are almost the opposite of what parents typically do immediately after the crying stops, which is rush in with stimulation, relief, and noise. What the nervous system needs in the immediate aftermath of a crying episode is not celebration, not stimulation, not even too much touch. It needs quiet, warmth, and time to stabilize. The second reason babies stop crying suddenly, and this one surprises almost every parent who hears it, is that the crying achieved its purpose before the parent even responded. Infant crying is not only a signal directed outward at a caregiver, it is simultaneously an internal self-regulation attempt, and sometimes that attempt succeeds on its own terms. The cry releases tension, activates the body, and in doing so can sometimes resolve the very discomfort it was signaling, particularly in cases of gas, positional discomfort, or mild sensory overload. This is why you will sometimes pick up your baby the moment the crying stops and find nothing. No obvious cause, no remaining distress, no explanation that satisfies. The cause was real, it existed, and the crying resolved it. You just arrived at the scene after the story had already ended. There is a third reason for sudden stopping that is less discussed and more significant, and it involves something researchers call checking behavior. In the middle of a cry, babies will sometimes stop abruptly to check whether their signal has landed, to scan the caregiver's face for evidence that their distress has been registered and a response is coming. This checking pause is brief, sometimes only 1 or 2 seconds, but it is one of the earliest and clearest demonstrations of intentional communication in the infant's behavioral repertoire. What the baby is doing in that pause is running a rapid assessment. Did my signal work? Is help coming? Do I need to escalate? Or can I begin to settle? If the caregiver responds, even just with eye contact, a sound, a shift in posture, the baby often does not restart the full cry because the signal was received and the system can begin to de-escalate. This is one of the most important things a parent can do. Respond to the pause, not just to the crying, because the pause is the moment the baby is most open to being reached. At first, this seems small, responding to a 2-second pause in the middle of a cry. But what you are actually doing in that moment is teaching your baby that communication works. Every time that loop completes, signal, response, de-escalation, the baby's nervous system files a small but permanent record. The world is responsive, and I have the power to reach it. And over hundreds of these interactions, across the first months of life, those records accumulate into something that developmental science calls secure base, the deep, embodied belief that the world can be trusted. Now, not every sudden stop carries the same meaning, and learning to distinguish between them is one of the most practically useful things any caregiver can develop. The stop that is followed by relaxed body language, loose limbs, softening face, closing eyes, is almost always a genuine resolution, a nervous system that has successfully completed its cycle. The stop that is followed by a frozen, rigid posture and wide, glassy eyes is a different matter entirely. That is a baby in shutdown, not in resolution. Shutdown occurs when the nervous system becomes so overwhelmed that it disengages entirely, not as rest, but as a protective collapse, a last resort when no other regulation strategy has worked. In most cases, what parents witness is genuine resolution or a checking pause, and both of these are healthy, normal, and developmentally appropriate responses from a working nervous system. But if you ever notice the sudden stops becoming more frequent, lasting longer, and being accompanied consistently by that rigid, glassy, unreachable quality, that is something worth discussing with your pediatrician, calmly and soon. Because the difference between a baby resting and a baby shutting down is not always obvious to the eye, but it is always meaningful to the nervous system experiencing it. Here is something that tends to reframe the entire experience for parents once they understand it. Your presence during and after the crying matters more than whether the crying stops quickly. A baby who cries, is witnessed, and then stops has had a fundamentally different neurological experience than a baby who cries, is ignored, and then stops on their own. The outcome, the stopping of the cry, looks identical from the outside, but the internal record written in each case is completely different, and those records compound over time. This is the hidden reason behind the title. The real psychology of why babies cry then instantly stop is inseparable from the psychology of what happens between that baby and the people around them. Your baby is not performing the crying, and they are not performing the stopping. Both are genuine. Both are driven by a nervous system of extraordinary sensitivity and precision. And that nervous system is, in every moment of every interaction, being quietly shaped by the quality of attention it receives from the people who love it most. So the next time your baby cries and then stops with that sudden, complete, almost startling finality, resist the urge to immediately either celebrate or worry. Instead, take one quiet breath, stay close, and watch. Because your baby is in the middle of something real, and your calm presence is the most powerful thing in the room. Watch the body. Is it loosening or stiffening? Is the face softening or going flat? Are the eyes finding you or going somewhere unreachable? Because in those first moments after the crying stops, your baby is telling you something just as real and just as important as anything the crying itself ever said. The cry was the signal, But the silence that follows is the conversation. And it takes a particular kind of presence to hear what is being said in it. Every baby who cries and then stops is completing a loop. And every parent who stays present through both the noise and the silence is helping that loop close in the healthiest possible way. Because what your baby needs most is not a parent who always knows the right answer. It is a parent who keeps showing up, keeps watching, and keeps choosing to stay. And here is the question worth carrying with you. If your baby's silence after crying is still a form of communication, have you ever stopped long enough to really hear what it was saying?